So this is a very exciting topic. ICE, the internal combustion engine. You will have heard a lot about this on this acronym in the past year. It really was the big success story of the 20th century, if you think about it. The ICE engine, few things so profoundly shaped our world and impacted our lives in the 20th century. It has been emblematic in so many ways of our dreams, our desires, and also, the root cause of a lot of our stickiest problems and worst nightmares that we're facing right now. It's been the heart of our economic growth story in the last century. The manufacturing of ICE cars has been pillars of economies. It's created great industrial fortunes around the world. I'd actually argue that the 20th century started in 1908 when the first Ford T's rolled off the production line in Detroit, launching the ICE car into the mass market. Before then, cars existed; they were around. And they're actually rising in popularity. But they were a niche kind of toy for the rich. They weren't a means of transportation in a mass scale. And actually, interesting thing. I don't know if you guys have been to any of you've been to the Transport Museum in London, Covent Garden. Very much worth a visit. You'll see that there were EVs way back when, in the beginning. Actually, a third of all cars on the roads before the Ford T's hit the market were EVs. So this epic race between EVs and ICE this is an age-old story, and we're kind of in the fourth or fifth chapter of that story. So despite being a symbol of freedom and a status symbol, and indeed become a necessity for functioning in many parts of the world, our dependence on cars has come at a great cost. And the cost is not just the £5 per gallon that you pay at the pump. Embedded in that, in the cost of the petrol that we put in our cars, in our ICE engines, is also the blood that's spilled in oil wars. There have been over 180 conflicts in the past century over access to and control of oil, propping up repressive regimes, petrostates. When your main source of wealth overwhelmingly comes from the extraction and export of one commodity, that really creates a perverse incentive for good governance. And so that's kind of known as oil curse. There's also, of course, something that is a ubiquitous nuisance that all of you will be all too familiar with, which is congestion. That actually comes at a huge cost. 10% of GDP is the value of the time lost in congestion around the world. And of course, there's also the polluted air and the road accidents and deaths, which combined, by the way, account for more than twice the number of deaths that we've had from COVID since the beginning of the pandemic. And of course, a lot of you will be aware, I think the most ubiquitous factor this past year has been climate change. The transport sector is responsible for about a quarter of CO2 emissions from fossil fuel combustion globally, with road transportation accounting for about 3/4 of that. So the ICE engine, as much as it's been a love story for us in the 20th century, it's literally been driving us into a wall or off the cliff. And for them to become so ubiquitous and entrenched in our way of life, many things had to actually happen at the same time. The ICE engine is arguably the most heavily subsidized good around. The primer in economics, for those of you who are not familiar, the difference between the price of the good and its cost, its total cost, is what we call an externality. And that difference, the externality, is arguably the largest with ICE cars than with any other good in the world. Think about all the public infrastructure that's needed to make cars not just viable, but the default option for getting around. The roads, the highways, the fuel stations, parking spaces, all the real estate in cities that's gobbled up by the need to cater to cars. In fact, cities are designed these days and for the last century with cars in mind primarily. I used to live in Beijing in the 1980s. There were 2 ring roads. Beijing took a decision to develop the cars, also because of the manufacturing argument for boosting, kickstarting its economy. Fast forward 30 years, there are now 6 ring roads. and they serve cars, not mobility of citizens. So we have the cost of heavy subsidization in terms of infrastructure, public budgets, and also in a very direct way, public budgets. Fossil fuels are heavily subsidized. 6.5% of the global economy, of global GDP, is going to fossil fuel subsidies per the IMF's analysis of a few years ago. I don't know what the latest numbers are, but this is per 2017. $5.2 trillion of subsidies, worth of subsidies going into fossil fuels. To put that into context, is about $10 million per minute in subsidies to global warming fuels. So these are massive externality generating machines. So that's kind of to put into context where we are. For those of you who've been watching, there's been a real crescendo of action and commitment on EVs, on electric vehicles this past year. It's one of the major priorities for the COP conference, the climate conference that will be hosted in Glasgow this year. And the main driver of that action, that crescendo of commitment, has been climate. We're at a moment now where countries and cities and businesses around the world are waking up to the reality that we need to, A, completely decarbonize our economies by mid-century. B, we need to do so, we need to halve our emissions by the end of this decade, by 2030, in order to be on track to reach that goal. And importantly, we cannot reach those goals without electrifying transportation. And we've seen an increasing number of countries come out with NDCs, the National Climate Action Plans, which include ambitious actions to decarbonize transport through electrification. The UK has made a commitment to phase out ICE by 2030. And we've seen a huge uptick in the number of cities pursuing net zero emissions, an 8-fold increase from 2020 from 2019. So we're kind of in an epic race between EVs and the need to decarbonize and the growth of vehicle usage. It's easy to mistake hype for reality when you consider that only 2% of vehicle sales this past year has been EVs, even though the sale of EVs has risen quite significantly. It's still a blip in the ocean. So in this discussion that will follow, we'll try and help you separate the signal from the noise to get to a lucid picture of where we are, where we're headed. And I hope as a result of this conversation today that you will all gain an understanding of what it will take to make this shift real to EVs, what challenges lie in the way, and how these might be overcome. And with us today to help answer these questions is a phenomenal panel. We have Justine Bornstein, who's an Insight Manager for Energy, Resources and Industrials and Global Transportation at Deloitte UK. I'll ask them each to briefly introduce themselves as well, so you get to know their trajectory to becoming experts on EVs. We also have David Hostert, who's head of EMEA, which I think is Europe, Middle East, and what is EMEA?
Africa.
Africa, right. For Bloomberg New Energy Finance. And we have Mike Strahlman. Am I pronouncing your name correctly, Mike? You will have the chance to correct me. So who's director of EV at JustPark, which is involved in the implementation of and rollout of EV charging stations in the UK. So without further ado, let me turn to you each just to give a quick round of introductions. Maybe we can start from you, Justine, and David, we can go to you next. And hopefully by the time we get to you, Mike, your microphone will be working.
Okay, so Justine, I work at Deloitte. I think your question at the beginning about EVs, I've been covering automotive actually for most of my research career in financial services. And starting from about 3 years ago, our clients were coming to us a lot and asking us about EVs. Is this really a thing? How soon is it coming? what are the ramifications across a variety of sectors, the supply chain. So it's something that we've very much been looking at in a variety of ways, from the actual car itself to business models around charging, the deployment of charging, things like that.
Thank you, Justine. Pleasure to have you with us. David.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. My name is David from Bloomberg NEF. I lead our European research. The Africa is in there as well. It's a big remit, but my job is really to coordinate some of the things we do. A lot about power, a lot about carbon markets, and then kind of the wider agenda. As we look at the kind of decarbonization, the traditional remit where I actually come from is power. So I used to be leading our wind research. In a previous life, I was a biomass analyst, and you mentioned, electric cars. Actually, some of the first cars were, powered with pyrolysis. So in that sense, what we've done has mirrored the kind of the journey of what the industry has done, starting with power. I think we have a really good grip now on how to decarbonize the power system. There's still lots to be done, but there's a clear trajectory. On transport, we're getting there, and then the next kind of in this triangle is industry. So these kind of the big sectors that we look at. And what I feel when I look at the transport sector is that there's a similar pull that I witnessed in the power sector just a few years back, when suddenly things were moving. And I think 2020 has been a really interesting year to that. So as we think about net zero, it's just absolutely important that we think about what net zero also looks for transport. So we always need to fast forward the discussion. How do we get EVs on the road, and then how do we decarbonize transport? So that's just really fascinating to me, and yeah, it's been fantastic to see how these different silos have all been started to get connected. Cities are a great vector to connect this. There's so many other avenues. So yeah, really looking forward to discussing some of those today.
Great. I look forward to hearing from you also on the city's perspective, David. Mike.
Thanks, Leo, and you had my name spot on, so thanks for that earlier. I'm Mike Strahlman. I'm the director of EV for JustPark, and from a personal perspective, I've spent the last 13 years of my career working in the energy industry, from Shell to Deloitte to services, and I've always been passionate about the energy transition. And for me, EVs are at the real crunch point for the consumer in what they can do to behave and act differently, but also participate in making the energy transition real. And at JustPark, what we're looking to do, of course, is through our mission, vision of reinvention of mobility and repurposing of spaces from a parking perspective, also applying that to the electric vehicle network and charging network infrastructure, and how we can, use the entrepreneurial mindset, but also kind of break down the barriers around adoption of EVs. And so I'm excited to be here to kind of add that lens to this discussion. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Mike. Delighted to have you with us. So David, maybe we'll start off with you. I described how ICE was the hero of the 20th century, and I think the expectations are very high that EVs will be the big success story driving the decarbonization journey in the 21st century. Do you feel that we are at or near a tipping point? If you may perhaps give us a kind of bird's eye view of where you think we are in this journey, and whether you feel like the pace is consistent with the need when it comes to climate.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we actually were a bit more optimistic on EV sales last year than you were in your introductions. We see passenger EV sales at 4% of new sales, which is, still in comparison, not a lot. But this is a massive increase in a year where overall vehicle sales actually dropped by quite a bit. So that's been way more optimistic than we thought maybe middle of last year. So we do quarterly outlooks at the beginning of last year. We had a good outlook. Then with the pandemic, we weren't sure. We had different trajectories. Turns out, looking back, our Q1 forecast was really much more on the money than our correction, and that's been really good to see. So globally, it's 4% of new vehicle sales for passenger EVs, and then if we go beyond passenger EVs, in the bus market, in the 2- and 3-wheeler market, which is a really important market, there the numbers are even higher. So for last year, for buses, it was 39% battery electric, And for 2- and 3-wheelers, which is, tuk-tuks in the street of Bangkok, mopeds in Beijing, that was 44%. And these are really growing segments. So just to kind of talk about the wider market. And then when we come to vans and trucks and heavy good vehicles, it gets a bit more depressing. There it was kind of 1%. And really in the kind of small truck segment, we haven't really started to take a bite out of heavy goods vehicles. And what's also been really interesting to see is that Europe has pulled ahead of China last year in a big way. In Germany, EVs were 14% of new sales last year. That's more than 1 in 10 new vehicle. In France and the UK, it was around 11%. And these are kind of really encouraging numbers. And we think that growth will actually continue due to 3 reasons. One is policy. The other one is EV model availability and the kind of overall addressable market as we actually get the vehicles that customers demand. And then that will eventually lead to the tipping points that you mentioned on upfront cost parity, which is, how much does a vehicle cost? And that's going to be critical to get us from these, initial markets where it's very policy driven into an actual wider adoption and get us up that up curve. In terms of kind of the mechanisms that we're looking for, so it's kind of the carrot and the stick, on the one side you have the carrot, which is consumer grants, CapEx grants. There it's been interesting to see that last year there was a big injection of money into existing schemes. So and these CapEx grants are important.
Are you talking about the European context in particular? Or,
we're talking about Europe, but similar in China, where you have these NEF credits. And the US subsidies, federal subsidies, are also still the main kind of push for EVs. And there's a federal level, there's a state level, but these are important. But they kind of mean nothing if you then can't buy something with that. And this is where the fuel economy regulations come in. That's like the stick if you want to. So that's actually drives the change and makes automakers offer the right vehicles. And last year, what's been surprising, I think, for all of us is how aggressive the European Union has ratcheted up their targets. So if you calculate back from a 55% overall reduction target, that means you need to get transport to around 55%, up from 37.5 today. And that's massive because this is eventually impossible to meet without battery electric. I mean, EVs are going to be the #1 compliance tool, and it's kind of less of a fuel economy regulation and more a sales quota for electric vehicles, because there's really very few other routes to comply with these high targets outside EVs. So, hybrids, mild hybrids. And we'll learn more about that in 2 weeks, really, on the 19th of July. That's when that should come out. And then, in the US is a similar picture. So we're waiting for fuel economy regulations from the Biden presidency. They were supposed to be more ambitious than the Obama regulation. They might end up somewhere where California is today, but still higher. So long term, those are the important kind of carrot and stick factors. But there's positive momentum. But we a few weeks back launched our electric vehicle outlook, the annual BNEF Evo outlook, and that for the first time looked at net zero. And if you look at those numbers, there's way more work to do. So on 2- and 3-wheelers, we're kind of on track. On buses, we're kind of on track. On passenger EVs, we're somewhat on track, but we need to kind of lift quite a bit, and we can talk about that later. And then on heavy goods vehicles, we're nowhere near on track. So it's lots of positive momentum, but still a pretty good way to climb.
That's wonderful, wonderfully rich picture you paint there, David. So a lot of action, momentum from the top down in terms of policy and regulations, subsidies, support. Justine, I want to turn to you next and maybe ask you to give us a view from the industry side and the market actors. How are they reacting? Do you feel that there's a readiness and positive anticipation of these measures, or do you see that there is resistance? Love to hear from you how this is going down in industry.
I think, there is, I guess, an acceptance among, say, car manufacturers. I think some of them, like have said that, you know, they're going to transition their production lines to complete, I mean, by 2026, they'll be doing EVs only. I think the interesting thing around EV charging is it's bringing in a different supply set of supply chains who are going to have to provide. I mean, there's a lot more chemistry, say, involved. There's a lot more, a different class of minerals that will need to be mined to supply the batteries and such. Charging opens up a much different opportunity that petrol stations just do not, because of the fumes and the flammability. It's challenging where to site a petrol station, whereas charging can be done anywhere someone parks, and electricity is everywhere in our cities. So you've got this opportunity. I think we're seeing a lot of money coming into the sector for sure from the private sector. I don't think that the EV uptake quite yet has reached the critical point that it's profitable per se. I think that consumers are still a little bit nervous about the higher upfront costs, and then the range anxiety issues and the need for, you know, a public charging network around wherever they drive. But for big pocket investors who have the ability to be patient and wait for the market to reach the necessary scale that drives profitability and then furthers uptake, I think you're seeing it, it's all there. One issue that is, I think, quite interesting, and back to the point that David had about, you know, wanting to talk about cities. The majority of people live in cities right now. They estimate by 2050, 70% of the world's population is going to be living in a city of at least 1 million people or more, right? And it's becoming a bit untenable to have cars, personal vehicles, in cities at the same sort of rate and density that we do now. And so what you're seeing is a lot of cities that are looking to regulate the use of the personal vehicle in the city and to push people into more public modes. Now, when we talk about EVs, I think most people tend to think of personal vehicles, but to David's point, any vehicle that can be electrified is an EV. So that would include a bus, a truck, light truck, heavy truck, a train. Lots of trains are already electrified, obviously. But even ships or airplanes, and, you know, the big manufacturers are definitely testing that. So I think the issue in terms of some of the health issues that you've laid out in your introduction around air pollution, around accidents, that will be mitigated when you have simply fewer cars in the city, full stop, and you have more people taking mass modes or active modes to get around shorter distances. So I think there's an appetite for that. That's going to be a big change in our personal behaviors. That's going to take probably a bit more time than the business rationale will, because I think for businesses or industry, if there's a market for it, there'll be players coming into the space to capitalize on that. What you need to see is a kind of nice combination of government direction setting, maybe some incentives to bring the industry in, and a lot of messaging and education of the consumer base to make sure that they're on board as well, because they're ultimately the ones that have to buy and ride in these new vehicles and to accept the new normal, whatever that is.
Thanks, Justine. I want to come back. Sorry. I want to come back maybe later to some of the points you raised there, but very good. An important point you make about needing to look beyond private vehicles and the imperative in growing cities to create more modes of mobility beyond the private vehicle, which even when electrified does not address some of the other problems associated with cars. Mike, you see obviously a business opportunity in building part of this ecosystem that Justine just spoke about, or at least a very critical part of it, which is the charging infrastructure. Can you offer a perspective from your side as an entrepreneur? How are you looking at this, at the business opportunity in this transition?
Sure, thanks, Leo. I mean, the first thing I'll say in echoing other comments is that this is a big challenge. We all recognize it's a big challenge. And as you said, Leo, arguably the biggest shift since the advent of the IC vehicle over 100 years ago. That said, from a business perspective, this challenge comes with great excitement. right? And as a result, it's kind of all to play for because we're at the start of the exponential curve of growth here. And so as a result of that, everyone wants to play. So that's across the entire ecosystem. That's the auto OEM, that's the hardware provider, that's a charge point operator, alternative technology, ancillary services and systems, you name it. And that's not even touching the sort of the whole value chain, including the electron provider and other elements there. And all of these challenges or all of these parts of the business and value chain, what are they seeking to do? They're trying to solve what I'm sort of calling, and it's not the first time you'll hear it, kind of the 3 C's of blocking EV adoption. That's choice, that's cost, and that's then the charging infrastructure and charging itself. And so what does that mean across that ecosystem? There's a lot of innovation going on, which is really fantastic and exciting, but that also means there's a lot of fragmentation for choices. So when you hear the word fragmentation, my first instinct is to say, well, hang on, that might not be a good thing, but actually in the short term, it's actually on the contrary. It provides optionality for innovative development to reach critical mass, which is really exciting. So with this in mind, plus complementary funding structures in place, such as public and private investment like the SIF or Innovate grants or government funding in the UK, businesses are looking to place bets on elements of that value chain, which are likely to reach critical mass most quickly. For me, on a personal level, the most exciting developments here and the most elegant solutions are and will be around propositions which pull the elements of that value chain together and offer integrated solutions for the end users, if that's a customer or consumer, but also for B2B, so if that's fleets or other B2B structures. And also, given that fragmentation, you need interoperability of the various elements of that ecosystem. And again, pulling those things together is really important from a business perspective, making something stick, making something work. So what does this look like? I won't mention names, but I'll give you examples. So, we're seeing, charge point operators that have hardware, but also fleet solutions, coming into the market as a unified proposition. We're seeing network aggregators across CPOs and hardware for public use, bringing all these things together. We're also seeing charge point operators.
Right.
Pardon me. And then we're also seeing exciting partnerships and collaborations to avail access to cheap, dense, bookable charging through exciting and simple interfaces. And a hint being that that's something that JustPark's doing, and which I can explain more later. But for me, I think from a business perspective, to your original question, what we're trying to do is knock down the hurdles for EV adoption. And kind of when we see the wave of these types of solutions begin to crest, it's when we know that we'll be able to start knocking down those challenges for adoption.
Thanks, Mike. And it's a very good segue here to maybe dive a little bit more deeply into the question of hurdles. Several of you mentioned some of the hurdles. Justine, you mentioned the need to the price parity point, which is obviously a big hurdle, and also the I can't help notice being in Paris right now. I arrived yesterday. The roads are super congested again. The people are moving away from public transport, and the crisis in public transit is standing in the way of the solution that's needed for cities, as you rightly pointed out, Justine. The problems we need to solve for are not just decarbonizing a mode of transport. It's designing cities and creating options, choices, as you said, Mike, that address the need to accommodate 2.5 billion more people who will be living in cities. And obviously we can't do that by mass adoption of personal electric vehicles. So I'd like to ask you, maybe we can do a round, we can go around and hear from you each on what you see as the main hurdles that stand in the way of mass adoption. Some of them have already been mentioned. You might want to elaborate. And also, importantly, what do you see as needing to be done in order to overcome those hurdles? Mike, should we start with you, since you're already going down that train?
Sure. I mean, as a caveat here, I think one of if we're talking about charging infrastructure, for example, until charging behaviors change, from this sort of concept of the ICE vehicle where you go to a petrol station and you fuel up, and that changes to topping up and destination charging and the kind of ubiquity of available infrastructure. From my perspective, amongst a number of issues, one of the primary issues to adoption is access to inexpensive, reliable public charging infrastructure. And that's not just for consumers, right? But that's also for, again, fleet and B2B drivers. If you take your BT OpenReaches or your Uber drivers, for example, who these drivers have to take potentially multiple hours out of their earnable time, their workday, to find a charger and to use that infrastructure. And that impacts their business. So the first question that those people might be asking themselves is, how can I get cheap and reliable charging? And one of the most common answers today is, in most cases, the cheapest charging would be overnight charging, where electrons are the cheapest, and prices are most advantageous. But then that comes back to, well, where can I charge? And in the UK, almost 40% of households don't have access to private parking, let alone charging. So that amplifies this challenge. From a business perspective, how can we help overcome that? And how can we help solve that dilemma? I mean, one of the things to think about is, how do we help solve that dilemma whilst also alleviating the pressure from the local council or from the government to provide that infrastructure, or even to fund that infrastructure, or competing for curb space or various other elements of that ecosystem. And one of the answers from my perspective is through leveraging the community. I mean, there are 500,000 vehicles on the road today that are personal vehicles on the road that are electric in the UK, of which almost 90% of those have access to private charging infrastructure. At JustPark, we're championing this concept of community charging as an elegant solution and an option for this challenge. And so what does that really mean? That's through the delivery and the building of low costs, accessible charging networks by electrifying not just private driveways per se, but also car parks, small businesses, community centers, and availing that, making that bookable and reservable for overnight charging or even daytime charging. And I mean, and that's just one of many options, right? And if you think of, I think the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Transport, the SMMT, came out with a study a couple of weeks ago that said by 2030, we need 2.3 million connections by 2030. I can't imagine a world where you would have all of that being, motorway side. It's not necessarily going to work. And so the question is, in this fragmentation with multiple options out there, how can you make that available in a cheap and reliable way to the public? And so to answer your original question, from business perspective, that's what we're looking to solve at the first instance.
Great, thanks, Mike. Justine, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I mean, this is hurdles, right? So I mean,
Yes,
I think Mike kind of mentioned the 3 C's, right? Cost, choice, and charging. As soon as electric vehicles hit price parity with internal combustion engine vehicles, you'll probably see more uptake, assuming that the OEMs are starting to offer as wide a range of vehicles. Because the thing about cars, personal vehicles, is they're more than just some utilitarian pod that gets you from A to B. They often are meant to reflect certain aspects of your personality or your wealth or whatever, your freedom-loving something or the other. So there's a personal branding issue in a way that comes with cars that you wouldn't see, say, with your public transport mode of choice, right? I do think that assuming that there aren't any supply chain bottlenecks around the minerals and the various technologies akin to what we're seeing with chips and auto manufacturing, as long as that doesn't block the rapid growth of EVs, because it's that scale that you need to see to bring the costs down. I think governments are probably going to need to switch their incentive systems as well. Right now, it's very pro EV in terms of subsidies and things like riding in the toll roads for free or free parking in some places. But the UK is a case where they've had a petrol tax on the books that they haven't implemented for at least 10 years or more. If they start to incentivize a shift away from, petrol vehicles by putting up the taxes on petrol or things like that, just making it really hard to buy them and own them and drive them, you'll see a shift. And so that, I think, would help. a question I have, I don't know if anyone else on the panel has a view on this, but we had been seeing prior to COVID a longer term, and I guess it came around since the last big financial crisis, the idea that millennials and Gen Zs were not interested in buying the car, they just wanted to consume it as the service. So there was this secular decline in car ownership from people of the two younger generations. That seems to have had a bit of a blip, a reverse in the trend since COVID. And I don't know if that's because people are a little more freaked out about getting onto public transport now because of the virus. But if that is a longer term trend, then what you're going to have to see is, young people don't get driver's licenses at the same rate that they used to. That's going to be a hurdle that will be a challenge to overcome. The only way I can imagine that gets fixed is a huge step change in automation, driverless cars, the ability of people who don't have licenses to use cars without needing to drive the cars or have a driver, like an Uber driver, in the car, and to get more people to use the cars. But like I said at the beginning, cities are, especially in Europe, are really pushing hard against the use of personal vehicles. I do think once the whole dust settles after COVID and people feel safe getting on public transport, you're going to go back to the existing trend where cities are putting in emission zones. They're getting much stricter about fuel standards. They're rezoning roads to prevent the rat running that we're seeing, as people try and cut through the little quiet residential side streets. Amsterdam, for example, pulled 10,000 parking spaces out of the city center just to make it expensive and a hassle to drive your own car, i.e. get on public transport. You see cities like Lisbon that moved to like a 40 euro all-you-can-eat public transport monthly pass as a way of incentivizing public transport use. So you've got this sort of battle going on. I do think the secular trend is more toward fewer cars in city centers and fewer car sales, full stop, as a cars in circulation car park. I think that's something OEMs are definitely getting their head around, but that's a Western European thing. It may not be the case in developing markets.
Well,
yeah.
I think, David, you're probably very well equipped to answer that question, having just produced a report on that. The numbers I've seen is that the expectations are that there will be about 1 billion more cars on the roads.
Yeah, that's sounds about right. I mean, we're past. I mean, we're now pretty confident that we're past peak ICE vehicle, and we probably passed that in around 2017, in terms of like total sales. It doesn't mean that car ownership still doesn't continue to grow. It just means that we'll have more EVs, more hybrids as well, and then we see total sales peak at around 2037. That's late, But I do agree with Justine. My wife tried to book driving lessons. Good luck doing that. It's nobody is offering. Lots of driving instructors left the industry, and they're just completely backlogged. So, but there seems to be this kind of temporary rethink. Shared mobility also suffered last year. That's just clear. I mean, overall, but also in terms of like the willingness to get into a car, and then secondhand car prices last year just completely went bananas. So I think that there are these like adjustments, but overall, I think that the trend is in the direction we're talking, and I think this is more like a blip. What I would say though, in terms of hurdles on charging, the infrastructure is important, because again, we talk about cities. Cities are generally well electrified. Fine, I live in a Victorian terrace. Fine, I don't have the right connector just yet. But there's a street, and you can't do that. I think where more is needed is to support charging infrastructure, and expand that dramatically, including for remote and otherwise underserved locations, right? So that's about grid connections. Kind of maybe we need to have some kind of rate-based approach to recoup that cost, to upgrade. I think that those are options we should be having on the table. If I think about London, like London, for example, I told you 44% of new sales are electric buses, but they all need to charge overnight, and they have big batteries. And like it's been a challenge to find a depot that is close enough to a strong grid connection to have those buses all charge at the same time and to draw a fairly big amount of power. And I also agree with Justine on the point of kind of push to reduce overall demand for vehicle usage. If you're in a city, first you should walk. If you can't walk, you should take a bike. If you can't bike, you should take a bus. And if you can't take a bus, you should take a car. And that, maybe it's not your own car. And we are very excited about autonomous vehicles. There's a full kind of section in our report. But it is a big step up. It's not just a linear progression. It is a really big step up. I don't know if you've ever test driven a Tesla, but that automated driving isn't that automated. It is a lane assistance, and you really want to have your hands on the wheel, especially on English roads. So, yeah, I think that the other points have been mentioned. But yeah, look, the momentum is there, but the policy is still the main driver. And just maybe to make this last point, in terms of cost parity, we see that in Europe by mid-decade. Between 2023, 2027, across all segments, we're seeing that crossover point, assuming battery costs continue to fall as they do, assuming we get those kind of scale ups, but that is actually within reach. But we still need to continue pushing. It'll be interesting to also, once we push, how you get out of that. How do you phase out capex grants? How do you make that transition? In the power sector, we talk about the need for a just transition. There's an element of just transition in here as well, because mobility isn't just another service. It is I don't want to say a human right, but it is a fundamental to the working of our economy, and something you just can't just pull and make prohibitively expensive for somebody who doesn't live in London or Paris or Milan.
Indeed. I loved what you said, David, about the hierarchy of priorities within cities, with cars being a last resort after walking and cycling and other modes. Very much agree with you on that. And the point also you made about the importance of policy, and maybe I want to pick you up on that point of policy, and two things that you haven't gone much into, but which come to my mind as big hurdles, is one, the power of incumbency, big incumbent interests that have their very strong entrenched interests behind ICE. And you can see, for example, I'm half Thai. I was in Thailand earlier this year, and I rented an electric car to test the infrastructure. That was my goal. It was a nightmare. And there's a reason that Thailand hasn't invested in the infrastructure. It's because Toyota has a major manufacturing base in the country, and they are influencing policy with their hybrid cars in mind rather than electric vehicles. So if you can, maybe David, or Justine, you can speak to that angle of the incumbent interests, which also speaks to the just transition question, right? There's a lot of employment in ICE. There's a lot of at stake with ICE industries. How do you address this shift in a way that brings along the people who are going to be made redundant in this shift? And lastly, so maybe that's a question for you. And I would also, Justine, you mentioned a really important problem about the other hurdle that we haven't really addressed is the bottlenecks, issue of supply chain bottlenecks. Will there be a strangle? And maybe David, you might have a perspective on this from your work. David, do you want to start?
I was going to just jump in, because something I wanted to respond to with David as not so much a hurdle, but maybe one of the pull factors that gets people in cars in cities. And it's kind of connected to your question around equity. And David, your idea of transport as a key piece of supporting infrastructure that can really determine the success of a city. And that is, people will stay in cars if it's really unsafe to use public transport, or if public transport provision is patchy or poor. If there are deserts, where it's just a hassle to walk a long distance to a bus stop, and then you wait forever, and then, you have to go in a really roundabout route to get to the hub that you need. And so cities, and Bangkok is a city I've spent a lot of time in, maybe doesn't have the best urban planning. It doesn't have the best provision of transport. You know, they've been building a subway, but SkyTrain is for wealthy people in a very small part of the city. And so as a result, you have 2- and 3-wheelers that are very popular modes. So that will help to electrify those. But I think like in cities like Johannesburg, which is the city we covered in a research project I did called the Deloitte City Mobility Index, it's just really dangerous to be on public transport, right? And so you don't want to get mugged. You stay in your car. You can lock the doors. You can roll up the windows, turn on the air conditioning. It's a safer option. That's what keeps people in cars. As a woman, you can tell me all you want that I should be cycling more, but if it's dangerous on the city streets, I'm probably not going to want to do it. If I live in a Middle Eastern country where I'm expected to wear an abaya, I probably won't get on a bike either, especially if it's 41 degrees in the summer or higher, right? And so you have to think of a combination of the environmental factors, and I don't mean that in the climate change sense, but the larger cultural issues, how far are you going? Do you have kids in tow? Do you have to stop at your parents' house and deliver them their prescription? I mean, how many trip chain, what's your trip chain going to look like? So I think there are also neighborhoods that are just not well served by certain public transport systems. You need to make them built in. And so cities that have effective governance, cities that have the ability to regulate and to dictate outcomes in terms of pricing, availability, will have a more successful ability to set the scene for consumers. But you look at cities like Nairobi, where it's kind of a free-for-all. People do need to go around. There's a whole huge private sector that serves commuters, but the government doesn't have a huge role in dictating what the fuel standards are, what the safety standards are, what the pricing is. And so that's probably a more purely capitalistic thing. But I think to kind of reduce hurdles or to increase equity, you need to have a balance between what the private sector is doing so they don't capture the regulators, but then regulation. And cities really are trying to get back in the game post ride hailing to make sure they can dictate outcomes in the transport setting.
Great point. Thanks, Justine. David, did you want to address?
Yeah, I mean, look there, you outlined some of the ways that we're supporting ICE vehicles and mobility overall. I mean, you could make similar arguments for the coal industry, for oil and gas, other extractive industries. Clearly, there's incumbent interest, and that's why kind of these phase-out targets are important. I was going to say phase-out targets because you mentioned Bangkok and the interests of certain automakers. In the UK, we have a similar situation. We have a ICE phase-out date. But it includes hybrids, plug-in hybrids until 2035. So ICE vehicles go stop sold, and then plug-in hybrids are included. And you could make an argument that that some of the automakers in the UK are invested in plug-in hybrids, and this is one of the reasons why this regulation exists. Not to say that they don't have a role to play, but coming back to my earlier argument about saying if we really want to be aggressive about net zero, then EVs are kind of the way forward, and plug-in hybrids have a weak standing as a compliance tool. There is momentum on the automaker industry as well. I mean, you've seen last year 2 more automakers have announced their phase-outs for ICE vehicles. So and in a way, the tide is also turned on the consumer side. If consumers get interested, then automakers get interested, and then you have that turn, and you don't want to be the last one to sit on the hill and not have a full palette of models, because as soon as models become available, Justine mentioned kind of cars as a lifestyle tool, then you want to have that choice. But mobility and getting around will just have all these multiple ways, and maybe it's that you send autonomous vehicle to your grandparents to deliver stuff to them, and then you have another mode for that. It just means that everything gets more complicated, and you will need a smartphone to navigate that, and you will need to have access, and you will need to have some governance, and weak governance is just a killer for all these applications. It's the same for the power system, it's the same for the transport system. So weak governance is always going to be a hurdle. to adoption.
Thanks, David. I see some really good questions in the box, which Marcus, thanks for pulling my attention to this.